Morning or afternoon or evening class. This is Professor Ormsby again. So this is my first sort of real lecture for the semester. And in a normal semester, we would, be in a classroom together, and I'd just be writing stuff on the board, and I would be asking you questions, and we'd be talking about it. So again, remember that you have to kind of adjust for the fact that I've pre-recorded these, and make sure that you're doing what you need to do to listen carefully, to pay attention, to take notes. This particular lecture I'm going to give you now is best if you've already read the Ehrlich chapter. So some of what I'm going to talk about is review of the Ehrlich chapter, and some of it is more in depth than the Ehrlich chapter, and some of it is new or a little bit different from the Ehrlich chapter. So do make sure that you have read that before you continue with the video. Again, I want to acknowledge that this is not a biology class, and some of you do have biology backgrounds, and so that's great. And it's even possible that from a biological perspective, in terms of study, that you're already set on this. But I think for most students, my experience at San Jose has been that most students don't really have a depth of understanding of evolutionary theory. So our goal today, or for this video, our goal is to really understand the moving parts of evolutionary theory. You're going to notice that I'm not going to cover, a lot of the great stuff that's in the Ehrlich. So you want to think of, in my class, the way I teach, you want to think of the readings and the lectures as being complementary, and not sort of, I just don't do that thing where I just repeat back to you what you read. I don't find that very useful. So there is going to be some overlap because it's necessary to make sure we understand concepts, but there's also going to be some, it's going to just be a different structure, and I'm going to be focusing on different things than Ehrlich does. All right, so the next thing is that, just as a personal note, I'm going to try out this week, with the 2 lectures this week, 2 different ways of doing lecture. So today I'm going to try using the whiteboard, which means I'm going to be typing words as if I were writing in a classroom. I'm not sure if it will work. So I'm not sure if it'll be good for you or bad for you, but I don't have any visual aids today. They're just concepts, so I think that this will be good for today. But anyway, in the comments, you can leave me feedback that, yeah, this worked, it was fine. And I'm just going to be typing on the screen concepts, words that I want you to know. So it's kind of a help for taking notes, but note taking is a little more complex than that. So without further ado, let me get that started. And I think you should still be able to see, me. I'm not quite sure how this works. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is to review some of the concepts from lecture 2. Just very quickly, remember that we had these ideas. So we had interaction, causality, complexity, and then we had the 2 big words, overdetermination and I'm not a very good speller, stochastic reasoning. Okay, so we had those 4 concepts, and or 5 concepts, I guess, if you count those last 2. I really want to focus on the first one and the last 2. So remember that in order to understand not just evolutionary theory, but also to be able to understand the relationship between nature and culture, you begin with the presumption of interaction, that human beings, the organisms that we are constantly interacting with everything around us, including other people, including other organisms, including inanimate objects and things like rocks and the air and water, okay? Then just remember that everything that I'm going to talk about today in evolutionary theory, when scientists research evolution, they are almost always presuming for overdetermination and stochastic reasoning. So that means they just begin with the presumption that whatever it is they're studying is going to be overdetermined, and that it will require stochastic thinking to figure it out. Okay, so remember, overdetermination means more than one cause, all of which have evidence and all of which are sufficient to create the phenomenon. And then stochastic reasoning is necessary because we can't identify a single cause, so we use probability to either say what is the likely cause or what are the likely set of interacting causes. Okay? Let me know below if you have any questions about that. Let me see if I can delete all of those. Oh, it didn't work. Oh, there we go. Yay. Okay. So we have a problem in evolutionary theory, or rather, let me say it this way. As humans became more and more curious about where animals came from and more skeptical about supernatural explanations, they began asking kind of big questions. So the two main questions that evolutionary theory seeks to answer is, where do species come from? And why are various forms of life different from each other? Where do species come from? So species is just the Latin word for kind. So where do different kinds of organisms come from? And then why are different kinds of organisms, why are different forms of life different from each other? There's an additional question that doesn't come up until later, although the Greeks already had thought of this a little bit, and that is, why do organisms change over time? Like, remember we did history in the last video. Why do they change from generation to generation? Why aren't they identical to the previous generation? And so those are kind of the problems that we're trying to fix with evolutionary theory. So we can think of evolution, in one sense, we can think of it as change over time. That organisms, let me be more specific here, kinds of organisms change over time. So over multiple generations, you'll get like 100th great-grandchild that is not the same as the 100th great-grandparent. And so the question or the problem becomes, why? How does that happen? There is two problems that I have encountered sometimes with students, so I just like to get them out in the air. First is the meaning of the word theory. So in American English, this is actually true in British English as well. In English, let's say, we use theory to mean two exactly opposite things. So most Americans, the most common way Americans use theory is in sort of a dismissive way, that if something's a theory, it's not real, it's not true, it's just a conjecture, a speculation, an idea. In science, that's not what theory means. So something that's a conjecture or a speculation is a hypothesis. Theory is the explanation of the evidence, okay? So we're going to be using for this semester, because in social science, we also use the scientific definition of theory. We're going to be using the scientific definition of theory always. And if there's ever a question, we need to ask each other, do you mean the scientific definition? So if you're not familiar already, you need to get in your minds that the scientific definition of theory is the best possible explanation given the evidence at hand. I'm going to say that again. Theory is the best possible explanation of the evidence that we have at hand. And you'll notice that built into that, the way I phrase that, is the notion of what scientists or scientific philosophy calls skepticism. Skepticism means that you always hold your ideas sort of lightly because you're always open to more evidence. And so when you get new evidence, it means you have to re-examine your theories, right? Because your theory should always be the best possible explanation of the evidence you have. Now, when phenomena are over-determined, very often you can have multiple explanations of the evidence, more than one explanation of the evidence, all of which are supported by the evidence, all of which are plausible. And so that's one of those places where scientists and social scientists alike have conversations or arguments with each other where they disagree on how to interpret that evidence. in evolutionary theory, the basic outlines of it, nobody really argues about anymore. The evidence is so overwhelming. And just in case you don't have it in your minds, I just want to be clear. We have millions of fossils, and the genomes of every single living organism on the planet all prove evolution. So there's no real arguments about that at this point. So there are a few scientists who are arguing we should call it the law of evolution. But the reason why that hasn't changed is because when you get into the details of how and why a particular trait on a particular organism changed, then you have an overdetermined phenomenon, and it becomes a little bit more tricky to make your arguments from evidence. So in the specifics, scientists argue a lot about specific organisms and specific changes. But in the overarching, just the theory of evolution as a whole, right now there really aren't arguments about that among scientists. Okay. So let me know if there are other questions about theory. Sorry, I can only do one thing at a time, so I had to type a hard word first. So there's an error that we tend to make when we think, an error, a teleological error. So I'm going to explain what this means in a minute. I just want to give you a little bit of background. We find that humans across cultures, so in various cultures around the world, the teleological error is rather common. So it might be kind of part of the way that our brains work. But it's exceptionally common, or let me say, it can be stronger or weaker depending on cultural bias. So depending on the culture you're raised in, your teleological bias can be stronger or weaker. In the US, our teleology bias is really high. So let me explain what teleology is and then what the bias is. So teleology is the logic of, so here's the basics, and I'll give you more details. Teleology is the logic of a goal, that time and space are moving toward a goal, that progress is moving toward a goal. And that it's linear, it's on a line. So if you think that the universe or the world or your life at an individual level is moving in one direction toward a goal, you are thinking teleologically, okay? In evolution, things don't work that way. And it took about 100 years, although Darwin and Wallace both already found this in the 1850s. It took a long time, even for most scientists, to sort of get this into their heads. There is no goal. There's no end point for evolution. That's not why the change occurs. The change isn't, in other words, the change isn't occurring to create better and better and more powerful and more dominant species. Any species that's alive and surviving is perfectly designed, and there's that tricky word there, right? But it's perfectly put together for its environment. And so there's no getting better from that, right? If you already fit in your environment, there's no better to be. But then if the environment changes or shifts, then that organism over time will have to have offspring that can adjust to those changes. So I will let you know that for some students in the past, teleology has been a hard concept. So again, in the comments below, if you need more explanation or help, just be aware. The reason we're talking about it is so that you can have in your head, like when you're thinking about evolution, like when you're thinking about human evolution, you think, why did humans get bigger brains? If you think they got bigger brains because bigger brains are better, or because, how do I say this differently? If you think they got bigger brains because humans are moving toward some sort of a perfection or some sort of a higher form of life, then you're a teleological thinker, and you will miss the actual explanation of why humans actually got bigger brains over time. This will come up over and over again over the next few weeks. So I think if you don't quite get it today, that you'll probably pick it up more as we go along. All right, so evolutionary theory is those big questions of that organisms change over time, right? So evolution is the changing over time of organisms. Then what we have is another problem or another question, which is how or why. How or why do they change over time? So that's where we get the theory of natural selection, okay? The theory of natural selection. So in a normal class, what I would ask you to do is to rate how many of you have heard of natural selection, how many of you have studied it. So what I think I'll do, because I can't interact with you, is to just have you pause the video and have you write right now your current understanding, what you think natural selection is and how it works. Okay. So now that you're back, I assume you started the video back up. So what you want to think of is that evolution is the change over time and natural selection is the mechanism. It's how the change over time works. And just as a note, we might, it depends on the semester, sometimes we talk more or less about them. Natural selection is only one kind of selection. So the first question you should ask is, what is being selected? What is being selected? So what is being selected are traits. Okay, traits are being selected. So a trait, there's a scientific definition of a trait, so I'm going to give that to you, and then I'm going to try to explain a little bit what it means. A trait is a distinct, let me say it this way, it's statistically and analytically distinct feature or characteristic of an organism. Okay, so it's analytically and statistically distinct characteristic of an organism. So it's something that organisms, that's part of their, well, actually, let me say that in a second. Okay, so it's a characteristic of an organism that I can point to, and I see that all of the organisms of the same kind have that trait or have a version of that trait, and yeah, so I'm just going to stop there. That's what a trait is. There are two big categories of traits for organisms. The first category is the easiest one. That's physical. They're physical traits. The technical word for that is actually morphological or morphology, which is just the word for shape, the shape of the thing, the body of the organism. The other form of trait is behavioral. Okay. So organisms act in the world. So even, I don't know if you've ever thought of this, but even plants are doing things. They're growing, they're moving in directions, their roots are going out in ways. And we also now know that plants actually send chemical signals out to each other. Those are all behaviors, okay? Again, questions below if you have any. And so what natural selection is selecting are traits, okay? Now, to understand natural selection, we use what's called the organism environment model. Okay, so we're going to define both sides of that. On one side is what I've called the biophysical world in our last lecture. It's also, let's see, how do I say that? You could think of it as the, you could even just use the word environment, but I'm wary of the word environment because of the way we use it in American English. It usually has more of a political meaning. So the biophysical world, but for human beings especially, this is true of many different species, but for humans, I want you to be really aware that our environment consists also of other humans. And because we're so interdependent with other humans and our success depends on other humans, we can't separate the human organism out from other members of its species. So I use an Old English word to describe this, umworld. We don't use this word much in English, and if you Google it, either I will come up or there's a whole sociological theory that uses the word differently. So umworld is just the Old English word for environment, and I just use it to be a little bit different from the word environment, because we often, when we say environment in American English, we usually do it like we use the word nature, where environment is something that's not human. But what I want you to do with the word world is to include humans in it. It's everything in the world that you interact with, including the beliefs, practices, and objects and other people of humans, of humanity, and the squirrels and goats and birds and, you know, amoebas and whatever, trees. All right. And then the organism is, I think, a little bit more clear. So what you want to think about then, here we have organism, environment. They are interacting. The organism is interacting in the environment. Okay. Give me a sec just to check my notes and make sure. Yeah. So one of the tricky parts of teaching evolutionary theory is that it's evolution, natural selection specifically, happens in a system, and that because it's happening in a system, because it's happening all simultaneously, I find as a teacher that sometimes it can be hard to talk about. So what you want to think about is that I kind of am jumping in and I'm talking about natural selection in kind of points, which means every time I talk about a point, something's getting left out. But then at the end, it should all come together and be sort of one idea in your head. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is to give you the actual four-part, this is super basic definition of natural selection, okay? So this is Darwin's theory, and there was another guy, I think this is how you spell his name, Alfred Lord Wallace. They both simultaneously came up with the idea of natural selection, and both on islands. So Alfred Lord Wallace was in Indonesia, and Darwin, as you probably know, was in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. They had simultaneously come up with this idea, and when they first presented it to the scientific community of Great Britain in the 1850s, they actually did it jointly. They presented the theory in a joint paper. So the theory of natural selection that they came up with, which more or less still holds today, although clearly 160 years of science, it's a lot more complex and we know a lot more about it. It's roughly the same as it was. So these are the four parts. First is differential reproductive success. So what that means, let me expand that a little bit. What that means is that each individual organism does not have the same reproductive success. So each individual organism will have a different rate of success. So we do need to define reproductive success, and this came out from statistics much later, way after Darwin was dead. But it turns out that reproductive success doesn't just mean that you have offspring. Instead, reproductive success statistically only counts if your children or your offspring have offspring. So you need 3 generations total, 2 generations of offspring before it statistically is actually reproductive success. And then each individual within the species has a different rate of success. So again, just to say it again, reproductive success is that your offspring survive long enough to produce offspring that survive. Okay? 2, traits are passed on from generation to generation. So Darwin and Wallace did not know how that happened. They did not know the mechanism of heritable traits. They just knew that it happened. So they had evidence, a shit ton of evidence, that offspring have the traits of their parents. They just didn't know how. So we'll talk about genes in just a minute, but we now know through Mendelian genetics, and then 100 years after Mendel, 120 years after Mendel, we also now know a lot more about genetics than Darwin ever did. Okay, number 3 rather, is that those heritable traits bestow or can bestow survival advantage. Okay, so First, what I'm going to say is that heritable traits are passed on from parent to offspring, and that those traits are what the organism uses to survive in its world, in its environment, in its biophysical world. Okay? Sometimes, then we have to add this advantage on at the end, sometimes particular traits allow an individual to better survive. They have a better chance, a higher statistical chance of surviving than their neighbors. So that's the advantage part. But advantage doesn't always happen. So at baseline, you pass on traits that allow survival. From time to time, an organism might pass on traits that give an advantage so that their rates are higher. But you also need to know, and this is important, that sometimes you can also have traits that are passed on that are disadvantageous, that make survival less likely. So that's really important as we go along. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 3 pieces, and I'm leaving off the 4th piece. So usually the 4th piece is competition, but I'm leaving it off on purpose. So you can write it sort of as a note if you want in your notes. The number 4 is competition, and we'll talk about later in this lecture about why we're skipping that. Okay, so let me delete that. All right, so reproductive success we've already defined, but let's make sure we have it again. An organism has an offspring, and that offspring survives to have its own offspring. That's reproductive success within an environment, right? Because it's about the interaction in an environment. All right. So number 2, heritability. That's that traits are passed on from parent to child or from organism to offspring. Heritability gets a little bit more tricky. What I'd like to do is to give you some basic genetics, but not a biology class, so not a lot, but I want to give you enough that we'll have the language to talk about evolution over the next few weeks, right? So just a few key concepts. So the first concept is genotype. At base, genotype is your DNA, okay? Genotype is, it's your DNA. That's what it is. Genotype and phenotype. So phenotype is, if I'm talking about you, because you are an organism, phenotype is you. Like, look in a mirror, that's your phenotype. Phenotypes are, actually, let me say, it used to be when DNA was first really first it was discovered how it was structured, and then and it was discovered how it worked in the 1950s. People who were really sort of excited about it came up with a metaphor that your genes, your genotype, your genes are like a blueprint. And your phenotype is your body, and who you are is basically built from that blueprint. But over the last 60 years or so, that has really gone away. That metaphor doesn't work well. So hopefully some of you bake or cook from time to time, because I'm going to use a baking metaphor, which is better. The genotype is a recipe, not a blueprint. So if you've ever baked a cake, for example, you know that you have a recipe. The recipe stays the same whether you're baking in San Jose or you drive up the mountain into the Sierras, into Lake Tahoe, for example, or you go to a desert where it's less humid, or you go to a tropical rainforest. That recipe stays the same no matter where you are. But the cake that I bake will not be the same. So notice that everything that happens in the baking of the cake, so one is just like air pressure, humidity, altitude, all of those things actually change the cake. No matter what the recipe has no control over that. Then there are other things, like I could forget an ingredient. The oven could be inconsistently hot. Most ovens have hot spots in them, for example. The water could be heavier or lighter, more or less minerals. My big Great Dane could run through the kitchen and make the cake fall. In other words, the environment that the cake is being baked in changes the cake. So even though the recipe stays the same, every cake that's baked from that recipe is different. So the genotype, your genes, are like a recipe. If the exact same, scientists are pretty sure about this, if the exact same genotype that's in your body right now, if your mother had had that exact same combination of genes inside of her a year later, you would be a different phenotype. You would not be you. You would be something else, because the environment would be totally different. The environment within which the genotype expressed itself would be different. So let me know if you have any questions. We now know that genes mutate over time. So this is post-Mendel. Mendel did not know that genes mutated. We know that genes mutate, and they mutate randomly, and they mutate for, sometimes they just, like literally they just mutate for no apparent reason. And sometimes they mutate for very obvious reasons, like radiation poisoning or something like that. When a gene mutates, when one of the chemical sequences of its DNA mutate, and mutate is just a fancy Latin word for change, right? So when it changes, that changes the genotype. Sometimes that genotype change doesn't have an effect on phenotype at all. Sometimes it makes the phenotype unviable, makes it so that the phenotype, the expression, the actual body, the organism that gets made can't survive. And very, very, very rarely, sometimes the mutation will lead to an even better version of a trait or to a new trait altogether. Okay? So what's key here is that it's random, it's arbitrary, and so there is no design behind it. There's no logic behind it. There is no goal. It's not teleological. Mutation doesn't happen so that a species can survive. If a mutation has happened that happens to allow a species to survive randomly, then the species survives. But there's no design behind it. There's no logic or intelligence behind it. This, again, has been studied intensely, and the statistics on it are very clear. And natural selection is actually so powerful that it only takes, depending on the organism and the lifespan, it only takes between 13 and 14 generations for a mutated trait to pass to the population at large. And it only has to be something like, I apologize that I didn't review this before recording the lecture. It's something like a 2% more likely survival advantage to actually change the species entirely. Okay. In evolutionary theory, we had something called the modern synthesis, and that happened in the 1920s, and that's where Darwin's theory of natural selection was sort of, brought magically together with Mendelian genetics, and it really changed the whole field of biology at that point. We just do that sort of normally now because, none of us were born before the 1920s, I suspect. And so for us, we just grew up knowing that genes and natural selection go together. But scientists had to actually figure that out. There are two things that genes do that I want you to know, and they're related. So I'm going to put them up together. We'll talk about gene flow first. So gene flow is how the genes for a trait get passed throughout an entire population. So traits become common in a population over time. And like I said, an advantageous trait will pass within 13 generations. Will not pass, it will become part of the entire population within 13 generations. So gene flow, again, is that traits move between organisms. And what's important is that not all traits are advantageous, and not all traits have anything to do with survival at all. And so you can get traits that pass through populations that have nothing to do with anything, that they just, through random mutation or just a random change or difference within the population, that particular trait flowed out and became part of the population as a whole. Genetic drift is also not natural selection. Genetic drift is just that over time, an isolated population, their genes will change. So as long as their genes don't change in a way that makes it so they can't survive in their environment, there's no reason for that change not to happen. So over time, genes change, and that's one of the ways we get new species. If you get a group of organisms that are separated, they're physically separated, so they can't interbreed anymore. And then just if you give them, 1,000 years, those will be now genetically different populations. They will be different species from each other. You can both genetic flow and genetic drift are on Wikipedia, and they actually are pretty good articles if you want to know more about them. And the Ehrlich definitions of them is also good. Okay. So this is a heading, like in your notes. We want to think about survival advantages. Okay, so that's just kind of a heading. Where do advantages come from? So remember, a survival advantage is when statistically a trait gives an organism just a slight edge, that they have a slightly higher chance of surviving in their environment. Okay, so let's look at how that works. Okay, let's see how survival advantages can work. So the first thing you need to know is that there are selective pressures. So there are things in the world. So remember world, so it includes other individuals of your species or of an organism species that put pressure, survival pressure on the organism. So the biggest ones are things like climate. So that would be availability of water, heat, energy, nutrition, calories. I'm just sort of listing a bunch of them, right? What does that organism need to survive within that particular ecosystem? So the selective pressures on an organism are determined by the ecosystem. So if I take an organism out of one ecosystem and put it in a different ecosystem, the selective pressures will be different. Okay, questions below if you have them. For humans, and actually for most mammals and some insects, and actually birds as well, so many organisms, selective pressures also include social. That means that within their species, interacting within their species, there are pressures put on them that are necessary for survival, or that become survival. Trying to think of the word. Let's just say they're necessary for survival. So take selective pressure. Anything that puts a necessity on the organism so that they can have reproductive success, so that they can survive. Okay. So then, within those selective pressures, we have different mechanisms of change. Okay. So I've given you a few. One I've already given you is genetic drift. That is change that doesn't come from pressure. It just is that the genes change over time within a population, and because of gene flow, they're shared within the population. So over time, that population of that organism begins to be different. Okay. Then the one we've talked about, and the sort of the focus of our class, is natural selection. Natural selection is where the selective pressures give advantages to certain traits, or make certain traits necessary for survival. Okay, so in natural selection, if you have a trait that you need in the ecosystem, you survive. If you get a version of that trait that gives you slightly better chance of survival, then you have a survival advantage in the same ecosystem. So it doesn't mean everyone else dies. It just means that you have a slightly higher chance of surviving, and that trait will probably then flow out into the rest of the population. Okay. Natural selection, this is now where I want to talk about competition and cooperation. So one of the big misunderstandings about evolutionary theory is this sort of dog-eat-dog brutal world where we're all just sort of out there like fisticuffs, like constantly fighting with each other for survival. And this comes from something called social Darwinism. It does not come from Darwin. And it's really it's from a kind of social theory from a guy named Herbert Spencer. Let me write that down for you. And we're going to talk about him in just a second, a little bit more. Herbert Spencer's notion of a capitalist society where the cream of the crop rises to the top. And so, and it gets tied up into capitalist ideologies about we want competition, so the weak will die and stuff like that. And that is not actually how natural selection works. So I'm not saying that organisms don't compete, because sometimes they do. So we have interspecies competition, which is where humans compete with, say, I'm trying to think of something like boll weevils for wheat, right? The boll weevils are trying to eat the wheat. We want to eat the wheat. So we're in competition with the weevils to eat the wheat. And there's also intra-species competition. So in humans, that's really mostly about mates. Which is also true of many other mammal species. But what Herbert Spencer misses is that all kinds of behaviors are necessary for survival, including cooperation, cooperative behaviors. And Darwin noted this very early in the 1850s. So like this is not something that was like the scientists only recently discovered or something like that. Humans are social. In fact, humans cannot survive without cooperation. Humans are one of the species that must cooperate with each other or they die. And so you want to just really make sure that you have, when you think about selective pressures, competition can be a selective pressure, but cooperation can be a selective advantage. Okay. There are other mechanisms of change as well. So I'm just going to introduce them to you here. These are the main ones that have to do with human evolution, but they're not the only ones, okay? So one is sometimes called kin selection, and sometimes it's called group selection, depending on the focus. So kin is just the native English word for family, right? So kin selection, and that's where family groups, the goal is for the family to reproduce its genes. And so if you have, there's a theory right now that I don't find yet, I don't think the evidence is yet strong enough, but it's a compelling hypothesis that one of the reasons why it's so common, or it's relatively statistically common for there to be gay men around the world across cultures, is because they actually help raise their siblings' children, which then gives their siblings' children an adaptive advantage through cooperation, right? And so the hypothesis right now is that there's no selective pressure against gay men specifically because especially their sisters' children survive at a higher rate. That's an example of kin group selection, or of group selection. There are many others, but that's just to sort of get it in your head. It is definitely something that comes to play in human evolution. Another one is called sexual selection. And just so you know, sexual selection is hotly debated right now. So I still think it's legitimate, but it's hotly debated among biologists. So the classic example that Darwin used when he discovered or figured out sexual selection is the peacock. So I'm just going to use that example to get you started if you don't know about sexual selection. So I assume you guys all know what a peacock is. So in peacock behavior, only the males have the giant fanning tail, right? But if you think about that in the wild where peacocks live, that makes no sense. So if you're this kind of yummy, tasty, big blue bird sitting up in the tree and you have a 10-foot tail hanging off of you, you can't fly anymore because you have a 10-foot tail, that means you're more vulnerable to predators. So that is a selective disadvantage or a survival disadvantage, right? And so what Darwin discovered was that the big tails are so attractive to the peahens, to the females, that the larger the tail is, the more likely the male is to mate. And so what you do, it's all statistics, right? This is that stochastic thinking again. it turns out that when you like sort of plug this into statistical analyses, that the peacocks, that the survival advantage in mating is so high that it cancels out the disadvantage of being vulnerable to predators. So there are all kinds of things. So one of the things that we would think about with humans, for example, is do humans have particular traits that probably come from sexual selection and not natural selection? That they come from the mating preferences rather than from selective pressures in the environment. There's also one called social selection, which is, there's a really important biologist named E.O. Wilson. He was at Harvard. He's kind of an old Southern gentleman. He's really super awesome. You should read some of his books if you have a chance. He had this idea, because he studied ants, that it's the survival of the species as a whole, not the survival of the individual. So an individual might have a trait that appears to be a disadvantage, and it dies and doesn't reproduce, but its death actually allows the group as a whole to survive. If that makes sense. So again, social selection is way more complex than that. Again, the Wikipedia article is actually not bad about it. There's some problems in it, but go ahead and look it up if you want a little bit more. Now, pause and take notes if you need to. Let me get this all set up for you again. So I want to talk about, this is my language. So this is from my experience of teaching evolutionary theory over the years, the idea of the good enough principle. So the way that natural selection works is, so I just want you to imagine, this is a totally dumb example, but let's just imagine that you're some kind of a rodent. you're a mammal with a tail. Let's say you're some kind of a rat, and you live out in the woods. So you're a wild rat. You're not a New York City rat. And your environment gradually over a couple of hundred years gets wetter and wetter. And it turns out that just randomly, one of your group of rats has a slightly flatter tail and is able to swim more efficiently with that tail. Okay, so two things have happened. One is the environment has changed. It's getting wetter over time. That is a selective pressure. So in order for a species to survive, one of two things have to be true. Either that change in the environment can't have any effect on the survivability of that species, which is rare. It does happen, but it's rare. Or two, there will be individuals of the species who, because they have a random trait, remember that phenotypes make us all different from each other, even though we come from the same species. So that within the variation of your population, some rats are better able to swim. They have maybe tails that are better designed for swimming. And because of gene flow, over time, that trait will get passed to the population as a whole. If the pressure continues, the flatter the tail, the higher the efficiency of the swimming, the higher the survival advantage, and you eventually get a beaver. So this is made up. I'm making shit up, right? So don't think this is science. I want you to illustrate with this example, okay? So what the good enough principle says is that as soon as you reach equilibrium, so as soon as the organism can survive to reproduce, as soon as the organism can have reproductive success, there are no more selective pressures. So there's nothing to select against. And the only thing then that really changes the species are other kinds of things like sexual selection or genetic drift. But natural selection stops working. Okay, so natural selection only works when there's selective pressures. That means you'll also notice that natural selection tends to select, I wonder if it'll let me, oh crap, it didn't. Natural selection tends to select against traits, not for them. Okay, so in general, if a trait is keeping you from reproductive success, you die. And that can take all kinds of different forms. It could be you can't eat enough, or you can't get mates, or you can have offspring, but your offspring can't survive, or, right? So natural selection tends to be a negative process where, not in all cases, but it tends to be a negative process, okay? So traits get selected against is more common than traits being selected for. What that means is that as soon, again, it's the good enough principle, as soon as the traits, the combined traits of that organism allow for reproductive success, there's no pressure that subsequent generations will need different traits, and natural selection stops working. So again, this is anti-teleological. Our teleological brain wants to go, oh, we're getting better and better beavers all the time. But as soon as that beaver can swim through the pond and has reproductive success, there's not really any natural selection pressure on the beaver anymore. Okay, does that make sense? It's good enough. Its tail is good enough. So it's what I think of as the good enough principle. It's not the best tail. If we got a bunch of engineers in a room, they could design a super awesome beaver tail that would be better than a natural beaver tail. But it's a good enough trait. It's good enough for equilibrium in the environment. So I use the word equilibrium a lot just because that's the word that comes to my mind. But if you know biology, the word is usually homeostasis. Environmental studies majors who are watching this, that's a word that's very important in environmental studies as well. So you probably know it. But here, what homeostasis means is the relationship between the organism and its environment. Its world or its ecosystem. All three of those, okay? Questions below. Now, we have a problem in evolutionary theory. And that is the idea of fitness. Now, the reason we have a problem, here's where, let me tell you the history. So this is because I'm a social scientist. I'm going to give you some history here. The reason why this is a problem is because the idea of survival of the fittest did not come from Darwin, and it did not come from biology. It came from Herbert Spencer, that guy that I was talking to you about a minute ago. He's the one that came up with that phrase. And what he was talking about was in society, that the people who are on top and running society are clearly the fittest for society and should therefore run it. So he was making social distinctions. He called it social selection, which is actually difficult because it's a different social selection than the one I was talking about just a minute ago. And he was talking about why, for example, in government policy, you should let sick people die or you should let poor people starve. It comes from that sort of dark place. And Darwin actually spent most of the last 20 years of his life or so, 30 years of his life fighting against it. The problem is that that phrase became so common in American and British English that biologists started using it. Okay? That may or may not be a problem depending on what the scientist means. What you want to know is that all fitness means is how I don't want to use adapted yet, how close to equilibrium the organism is, how close to homeostasis is that organism, how close to having no selective pressure is that organism. If you are in your environment and you are in a state of homeostasis, you are fit for that environment. Okay? I try not to use those words just because as a social scientist, they give me the creeps. But like I said, even biologists use those words now, so it's totally fine if you use them. I'm not going to grade you down. As long as it's clear that I know what you mean by them, that should be fine. Okay. We're nearing the end. You guys are troopers. I'm not sure how long this is. This is probably longer than I intended to go, but I'm almost done, and you can divide this up into 2 sittings if you want. Okay. So now let's talk about this is almost to the end of our talk today. Survival advantage. Okay, this is part 2, right? And this is adaptation. So adaptation is a tricky word in evolutionary theory. and it's a word that we get tripped up on a lot. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is to just try to give you some vocabulary to think about adaptation. Okay, so get it back in your mind, a few ideas. Remember what a trait is. Okay, remember that traits are always interacting in environments. And remember homeostasis. Okay, so those are the sort of background concepts that you should have going in your head. So I think the best way to talk about it is that in evolutionary theory, we have a language problem, and that is that English has this one word, adaptation, the verb to adapt, and we basically use it to mean 5 or 6 different things. So for our class, I'm going to give you 4. Okay, 4 different ways we use the idea of adaptation. So I'm going to go ahead and yeah, I'll just do that. I'm going to number them for you. All right. I'm also getting tired and as I give this lecture for you. Oops. Okay. Number 1 is adaptive flexibility. Okay, adaptive flexibility. So adaptive flexibility, I'm going to actually type this out because it's so important. You have to know it. Adaptive flexibility is intragenerational. What that means is within a single lifetime. Okay, so adaptive flexibility happens within the lifetime of the organism. There are 2 kinds, and behavior. Okay, so physical adaptation is a physical change that happens within the lifetime of the organism. Sometimes the organism has control over it, sometimes not, but it's a physical adaptation. So just think for a minute, what changes over a human's lifetime? Like, I don't mean aging. So aging is a different phenomenon, but I mean like what physical changes happen over the lifetime of a human. So the most obvious thing that you might think of is that skin color changes. So our skin changes tone depending on how much sun we're getting. And that is true of all humans. So don't be a racist about this. Like all humans of all colors get darker and lighter depending on their exposure to suns. To the sun, we only have one here on Earth. Another example of physical change over lifetime is our percentage of adipose tissue, which is fat. And humans are actually predisposed to be fat because it's an adaptive advantage to have a big store of calories on your body. So that's examples of physical changes that happen within a lifetime, which show some adaptive flexibility. So if you have within your own lifetime an ability to change physically within your lifetime, that adaptive flexibility increases your chances of survival within your lifetime. Okay. An example of a behavioral flexibility is what is the range of possible behaviors that a species can engage in? Okay, what are the range of possible behaviors that an individual of any species could engage in within its lifetime? So some species, if you think about it, some species have a very narrow suite of behaviors. In the wild, non-human world, predators tend to have slightly larger suites of behaviors. They tend to be slightly more flexible as they hunt. As hunters, that gives them a hunting advantage. What makes humans different and what we're studying in this class is that our behavioral flexibility is massive. And that's partly, not entirely, but partly because of our ability for culture. Okay. So what kinds of behaviors can you change within a single lifetime? So that's adaptive flexibility. Now the problem is that when we say that a species adapts, that happens intergenerationally, right? So this is just an adaptive trait. If a trait is adaptive, that means that it's between generations. Okay, it's organism to offspring to offspring. Most traits cannot be changed by an organism. Most traits have to gradually change over time as the genes change and flow between generations. Okay? So when we say that a species adapts, we're talking about over multiple generations that the species, for all of those random reasons that have to do with genes and mutations and gene flow and right, all of those things that happen over time as a species adapting. When we talk about an individual adjusting to its environment within its lifetime, that's adaptive flexibility. So actually, let me come up here and add the word. This is when you adjust to changing environment. Okay, so that's number one. When within an organism's lifetime, when they are able to adjust to their changing environment, that's adaptive flexibility. But if they can't adjust, that usually leads to death most of the time. And by the way, just because I forgot to mention this earlier, the vast majority of genetic mutations also lead to death. Most of them are neither neutral nor advantageous. Then we have, and this actually gets us here, maladaptive traits. So mal is just Latin for bad. So a maladaptive trait is one that gives a disadvantage in the environment. There are degrees of maladaptivity. Sometimes an organism's reproductive success will just go down, but other times it will just crash and the organism will die. So a maladaptive trait is selected against by natural selection, and it isn't that it can't be passed on, but it's that because it's maladaptive, the chances of reproductive success are lower and lower. Okay, most maladaptive traits just lead to immediate death of the organism. At least that's my understanding. A biologist might have a more complex take on that. Now, my favorite are what we call adaptively neutral traits. So a lot of times professors will talk about earlobes as an example. There is no adaptive function of this trait, but humans have them. So where do they come from? And there are actually lots of examples of traits that an organism has that are actually adaptively neutral. They give neither advantage nor disadvantage in the environment. They do not affect homeostasis, okay? So I wish I could draw on the chalkboard because I need to draw something for you. And I don't think I can do it with a, here, I'm gonna pause the recording really fast and see if I can find, nope, it's not gonna let me. Okay, I apologize for that little mix up there. I'm going to have you, maybe I'll post this online, but if you Google the word spandrel, it's an architectural term, and it comes from when you put two arches together. I'll post a picture of this when I put this online, but when you put two arches together, between those two arches there's a triangle, and that triangle serves no function architecturally or in an engineering sense. Like if you're an engineer, you're worried about like weight-bearing walls and like, will the wall stand up? Will it fall over? Where, right? All of those things. That triangle between, so right, can you see in your head like a McDonald's arch? That between the two arches, there's a triangle. That triangle is called the spandrel. You cannot put two arches together. It is impossible to put two arches together without creating that triangle, but that triangle has no purpose. That's a spandrel. So the reason why that's important with adaptively neutral traits is, so I don't know about earlobes, for example, but there are many traits that we get accidentally as spandrels that have they're not selected for or against. They are the consequences of other traits. Okay, there are a lot of examples I could give you, and I think I'm just going to talk about another hypothesis about homosexuality. Because I already used that example earlier, so it'll sort of be a synergy there. Another hypothesis of homosexuality is that It's a spandrel. It's an accidental or inescapable, consequence of sexual reproduction. So in sexual reproduction, at least on planet Earth, almost all species are sexually dichotomous, and the process of becoming sexually dichotomous happens in development, when the embryo is developing and as the offspring is growing up. And that process of sexual differentiation is so complex that it sometimes creates or sometimes results in individuals who do not desire to sexually reproduce for whatever reasons. And it turns out that the advantages of genetic mixing through sexual reproduction are so astronomical that there is no selective pressure to eliminate that spandrel of either homosexuals or asexuals or people who just don't desire to have offspring. They're not bad for the species. They're just they're a spandrel of the evolution of sexual selection. That's a kind of a complex example. I apologize for that, but hopefully you kind of are starting to get your brain around it. The issue here is that adaptively neutral traits can either, they can be one of two things, and this is in your AirLick, so you should have this. They can either be what's called a pre-adaptation, or they can be a hangover. So a pre-adaptation is a trait that right now plays no role in homeostasis, but if the environment changes, it could play a big role in homeostasis, okay? A hangover is a trait that used to be key to homeostasis, but now the environment has changed and is now no longer necessary, but we still have it and pass it on from generation to generation, or organisms do, okay? So that takes us through the basics of evolutionary theory. I apologize that I went over time. Hopefully you were able to break it up a little bit. Hopefully this clarifies questions you have in AirLick. Hopefully it also raises more questions. Be sure that you ask those questions. Let me get myself back high. Make sure you ask your questions down in the discussion. And I will look at them at least twice next week, or to me it's next week, but when you watch your videos, I'll look at them at least twice during the week to make sure that people are understanding and understanding the concept. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say and answering your questions. Have a great day.